can't see anything on my screen. Just 1 second. Yes, thank you so much. Sorry about that. Is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just 1 minute. I'll just get it back.
You can proceed.
I'm sorry about this. I'm having some issues with my screen, so I'm just waiting for that to stabilize. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me back here. And perhaps, since today's session is on SDG-1, which is on ending poverty in all forms, one aspect to just kind of highlight is that you've probably gone through again a lot of the sessions over the last couple of yesterday and today. So it would be interesting to also hear insights from that and the linkages. And for us, the as an organization and as we look at it as a sector, when we look at the development sector, poverty has a link to all of the other sustainable development goals. Addressing the needs of poverty and climate action are actually quintessential to addressing the entire sustainable development goal agenda itself and the 2030 agenda. So I think it's worth taking cognizance of this fact that this is somewhat of an overarching goal because it links back into all of the other goals that we would have looked at and have spoken about. We spoke about this briefly yesterday in the SDG-5 session, but maybe just to highlight and stress on it that there are contributors that result in communities often either ending up in a vicious cycle of poverty, and often, at least in the current circumstances, climate change vulnerabilities and natural disasters seem to play a very crucial role in actually, or rather play a adverse role in pushing communities into poverty and often resulting in the vicious cycle of poverty itself. We also find that in multiple countries around the world, there are social conflicts and political conflicts that tend to result in a lot of humanitarian crisis, where people are forced into refugee camps, people are forced into internal displacements. They're no longer in the areas where they've built their livelihoods and built their infrastructure. They're having to move. And broadly, this is referred to as the humanitarian crisis that we see around the world, where it's a mix of people affected by natural disasters, people affected by social and political conflicts, and people moving for economic reasons, which results in them being internally displaced, being in refugee camps. The reason I'm highlighting these two in particular is because even when we think about poverty, there is poverty that is as a result of climate change and vulnerability, where you may have access to resources, but the productivity of those resources is low because there is no rainfall, and therefore there is a drought issue, or that weather circumstances result in heat stress, which in turn affects agriculture or the livelihood, or it may be that you're struck by a natural disaster, and therefore the way you look at your own assets, your built infrastructure, your access to resources also gets affected. And these are people who end up with natural disasters because it happens on an annual basis. Often people are pushed back into this cycle of poverty. And I think for us, when we, as a country and as a world, when we look at the effects of COVID-19 and especially the lockdowns owing to COVID-19, we can really see that economic crisis. There are World Bank statistics on how people, all of the progress that was made over the last decade on poverty alleviation has been pushed back because of the kind of crisis created by the lockdown. So how do we then create inclusive policies, assets, and safety nets for these communities to actually be resilient to climate change or to be resilient to shocks like these economic crises and social conflicts? And what we also find is that there is a lack of innovation for the last mile, which means that communities are having to depend on the same kind of resources that they've always had to bring themselves out of poverty. Without the innovation for the poor being at kind of the center of our work, it becomes very difficult to talk about creating resilience for last mile communities and actually ending poverty. So when we look at ending poverty in all its forms, again, I've chosen not to just look at the targets that are there in the UN agenda. That is something that is available online, and we can easily go through all of it. But I think it's to highlight two types of poverty and vulnerability and try and kind of highlight some of the ways in which work that we've done with partners has built that ecosystem around safety nets itself, or created safety nets that can help these communities at least build resilient infrastructures for these communities that can end their vulnerability that results in furthering poverty. So you have, climate vulnerability in terms of flooding and cyclones that I mentioned happen on a yearly basis, which results in worsening the conditions of the people. You also have droughts and dependent on animal husbandry into situations of shock. And when we look at socioeconomic vulnerability, I just want to highlight kind of examples from when you look at extremely remote forested and tribal communities, for example, in Odisha and Kalahandi, or in parts of the Northeast, or in parts of East India, Chhattisgarh, and also within Karnataka, forested areas in Joida or in Uttara Kannada. There's a certain vulnerability that comes that you cannot always say is income poverty, but it's poverty that comes with the circumstances, the geography, the climate risks that or the lack of maturity of the local ecosystem that actually makes people poor and vulnerable. So someone who is when you look at income poverty in Manipur, it may be that they're earning an income, but the challenge is really the complete lack of infrastructure. Or in Assam, it may be that they're able to earn an income through the year, and their income levels may be better than someone in Gulbarga or North Karnataka. But at the same time, someone in Gulbarga and North Karnataka actually face multiple climate challenges because of droughts and heat stress, while someone in Assam may face climate challenges because of flooding and cyclones, and technically they may be above the poverty line. So I think when we think about ending poverty as a concept, we need to also actively think about the kind of vulnerabilities that are there. And within socioeconomic vulnerabilities, two things to highlight are when you look at disability and differently abled communities, when you look at marginalized individuals, for example, transgender communities, and then looking at forested or tribal communities which have lacked access to resources, sorry, which have had access to resources that are in the local region but have not seen local sustainable development and therefore lacked access to services and infrastructure. um, when we think about, therefore, innovation and ecosystem building for these communities, how do you look at it? It cannot simply be that everybody is poor. We find that within the range of poverty itself, there are people who are poor, there are very poor, and there's abject poverty, and it's important to customize it accordingly. So there may be a poor person in South Karnataka, but if they are able to access a loan, their situation is still poor, but it may not be abject poverty. Whereas if I'm talking about Kalahandi and tribal community in Odisha, their access to financing, their access to technology, their access to local development may be limited, and therefore they may fall under the bracket of abject poverty. And so when we think about solutions, it is a mix of not just looking at so solutions are typically a combination of technology itself, technology and infrastructure, where our work looks at sustainably powering this technology, but the technology and infrastructure are critical pieces of the solution. But it doesn't end there. We often crib about technocratic approaches where people only think about the technology, put it, and walk away. Whereas addressing poverty is actually a combination of also building appropriate financing and business models and also ensuring proper ownership. Does that asset or that technology be owned by an individual, or does ending poverty require that it is owned by groups like farmer producer organizations or self-help groups where you can decentralize ownership? You don't have to have one individual corporate company running a certain production business. How can we make sure that communities and collectives and groups or farmer producer entities are involved so that the value capture, whatever benefit and profit is coming from that kind of productive activity, actually gets distributed across multiple people, which then makes us one step closer to addressing SDG-7. Again, this was something we touched upon yesterday, but I think I also wanted to highlight it from the perspective of ecosystem building for vulnerable communities or for communities that are likely to be affected by disasters or in humanitarian settings. How do you build technology and innovation in such a way that it is portable, that it allows for climate resilience, that if a person is affected by a flood, they can actually pack this system and move it with them to the disaster shelter? How do you make sure that when you look at financing for poorer communities, that a certain amount of capital subsidy or gap financing is built into it, but you're ensuring that the operational cost of that solution can be managed and borne by the individual end user? That in order to maintain the solution, in order to ensure its repair and maintenance, that people are able to afford it. And this may be true for any kind of solution, not just for energy solutions, but building in processes where even if you're subsidizing the capex, is there a way for the community to cover the opex, or is there another pool of money that is provided for maintenance and servicing? Because without that, any asset that you put on the ground for improving livelihoods or improving healthcare or improving well-being will become obsolete at some point. And finally, I think some of these we've spoken about, but also ensuring that when we talk about entrepreneurship and skills, we are building local skills and local entrepreneurship. Often we think, I mentioned this earlier, that we think that one large corporate company can enable development and can end poverty. Whereas our strong belief is that decentralizing entrepreneurship, decentralizing access to finance, such that local entrepreneurs can be built is really the key to ensuring that development can happen more equitably, which is critical for SDG 7. So even when we talk about enterprises, micro enterprises and enterprises where there may be non-English speaking people, how do you support that effort so that it doesn't depend on making a PowerPoint or a Excel sheet that people are getting equity money or are getting funds for their business or their enterprise, but rather it is based on the acumen or the skill of the person. And so local entrepreneurship is critical as part of, or strengthening local entrepreneurship and vocational and vernacular entrepreneurs is critical as part of kind of ensuring equitable, sustainable development. If it's okay, I'm going to play this video. Please tell me if you
Today,
can hear it. Is it audible?
Yes, ma'am, you can play.
Okay. So I'll just make it full screen.
in India, there are more than 300 million people living off the grid, and many of these people are living in absolute poverty. One of the critical reasons that poor are in poverty is because they do not have access to energy. SELCO is an organization that pushes for sustainable energy solutions to underserved in a manner that their quality of life and incomes increase. Energy is a critical component for health, education, and livelihoods. Today, if you look at health, people just rely on fossil fuels in a public health center. They use wood for cooking, which is a very unhealthy resource. Kids cannot study in the night because there's no electricity.
The problem is that even though there is power, very often it's not reliable in nature. So I might have energy, but I might not have the right kind of appliance. Or I might have energy, but at the critical time, it gets cut.
ನಾಗರಾಜರೇ ನಮಸ್ತೆ, ನಾನು ವಿವೇಕ್ ಶಾಸ್ತ್ರಿ ಅಂತ ಸೆಲ್ಕೋ ಸಂಸ್ಥೆಯಿಂದ ಬಂದಿದ್ದೀನಿ.
So what SELCO does is maps out the needs and the problem statements that come out from the community.
ಸರ್, ಈಗ ನೆನ್ನೆ ಫೀಲ್ಡ್ಗೆ ಹೋಗಿದ್ದಾಗ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಒಬ್ಬರು ಬ್ಲ್ಯಾಕ್ ಸ್ಮಿತ್ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ.
Currently, the blacksmiths in rural areas use a furnace and a blower. And the blower that they use is either a large wheel or it's a very inefficient motor.
ನಾವೇನೀಗ ಇದು ಫ್ಯಾನ್ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ, ಅದೇ ಥರ ಅದೇ ಮೆಥಡಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾದ್ರು ಅವರಿಗೆ
ಅದನ್ನು ಸೋಲಾರಲ್ಲಿ ಓಡಿಸೋ ಥರ ಏನಾದ್ರು ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು.
ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು.
Together we come up with a solution. A solution is of three parts. One is technology innovation. One is creating the appropriate financial product that matches the cash flow of the poor. And the third is the appropriate market linkage for the intervention.
ಅದರಿಂದ ನಮಗೆ ಖುಷಿ. ಈ ತಿರುವುದು ಅಂತ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆನೇ ಇರಲ್ಲ, ಈಗ ಯಾರೂ ಬೇಕಾಗಿರಲ್ಲ, ನಾನು ಒಬ್ಬನೇ ಇದ್ದರೆ ಸಾಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ನಾವು ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ತೀವಿ ನಾವು.
The roti rolling project, the need that really came out from the field was that these entrepreneurs that are making flatbread aren't able to own machinery because of energy access issues, and newer entrepreneurs don't have many options to actually start new businesses.
ಮೊದಲು ಕೈಲೇ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಸರ್ ನಾವು. ಆವಾಗ ದಿವಸ ಒಂದು 200-150 ರೊಟ್ಟಿ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಸರ್.
The solution is essentially a piece of machinery powered with solar, which is very efficient, along with a financial model that enables the micro entrepreneur to pay for it over a period of time.
ಅದೇ ಸೋಲಾರ್ ಮಿಷನ್ ಒಳಗೆ ಡೈಲಿ ಒಂದು 500-600 ರೊಟ್ಟಿ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ ರೀ. ಹಂಗೆ ಡೈಲಿ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಹಾಕೊಂತ ಹೋಗ್ತೀವಿ ಸರ್.
Critically, what we have done is not only the poor have got the sustainable energy intervention, but we have made sure that they have become bankable. They are credit worthy. For example, in one case where the very poor have a lighting, it was not about just going to households and providing solar. In this case, we went to the Apex Bank and scaled up the process of guarantee. And that will reach more number of poor people in a faster period of time rather than us going to every community and creating a solution. we come out with a solution that not only benefits that particular community, but have we come out with a process that is replicable for similar communities across the world.
Sorry about this. My screen has shut down again. I'll just have to restart. Sorry. Oh, it's back. Okay. I don't know what is happening with this. I hope it'll not do this again.
Today in India, there are
One second. So I think the idea with the video was really to and again we're using sustainable energy as an example of the kind of assets, the kind of infrastructure, the kind of solutions that are required for poorer communities to really build those safety nets for them to come out of poverty. But the key thing to take away from this is really in order to address poverty, to develop solutions for the poor, we really need to focus on that technology innovation that is customized and designed for communities. We need to look at the financing and ownership models. Financing and business models, and we need to make sure there is ownership on the ground and linkages to these markets or linkages for inputs in order for people to actually see the outcome of any solution. Here I'm bringing in kind of two examples of climate vulnerable poor individuals or poor communities and how to look at building safety nets. So in Assam, you find that the Brahmaputra River has constantly over the last 20 years constantly changed its course. And what this means is it results in annual flooding, and because of the heavy rains, there are a lot of riverine islands along the Brahmaputra, and many of these are affected and get cut off from mainland for a few weeks to a few months in the year. And we saw this in August this year. We've seen this the year before, we've seen it the year before. So this is not a one-time challenge. This is actually an annual recurring challenge. So this is the kind of shock that tends to push communities into poverty, right? So we look at a community where it's primarily agrarian, but there are field-based organizations that work on providing immediate relief in the aftermath of a flood. But there's also damage to the electricity grid during disasters. And why is that important? Because then your access to services, whether it's basic telephone, basic lighting, healthcare, a lot of people are affected by waterborne diseases and malaria and dengue during that time. But they don't have any way to access a healthcare facility because a healthcare facility itself does not have electricity, right? Similarly, to look at any kind of livelihood and bring themselves back to a position where they're earning an income becomes or even simply milling their own produce becomes difficult because again there's no access to services and the assets are lost in the process of a disaster of this sort. So some of the solutions we've looked at are really how do you build disaster relief shelters that take note of the needs of this kind of vulnerability. So you're then designing disaster relief shelters knowing that flooding is going to happen on a yearly basis, but you're designing the shelter to be climate resilient. You're designing the shelter with solar powered solutions so that even if the main grid gets cut off, this structure will still have basic energy access, mobile charging, lights, as well as portable health kits, right? if you look at this particular picture, it's actually from a video where it's a portable solar water pump. And so what they do is they put it in a boat. It's a plug and play model, and they move it from farm to farm using the river itself, so that nobody has to, there might not be, one person may not want to own the entire solution because they only need water for critical irrigation at certain periods of time. But this way, there's a shared portable solar pump system that they can use across the year, across multiple, fields as well. So then they move it in a boat, but then the innovation has to ensure that it's portable, that there is plug and play integrated into the solution, right? Similarly, having a decentralized solar rice milling unit, because they're getting cut off from the mainland. So even if it takes 3 to 4 weeks for electricity supply, between 3 to 4 weeks to 3 to 4 months is what we understand, for electricity supply to be restored, they can make sure that whatever milling they have to do, so typically the flood water recedes in a few weeks and then they regain some of their activities, but they're not able to do a lot of this in the absence of energy, right? So energy comes in to play a critical role in creating that safety net for these communities. This is a similar example, but in cyclone affected areas where community facility centers for pottery. Now, pottery is a basic livelihood for these communities, right? Again, cyclone comes in. Within 1 week, people are able to, within a week or 2 weeks, they are able to come back from the disaster shelter and come back to their homes to rebuild their homes. But suddenly there's no electricity access, there's no energy access, they're not able to undertake any of their livelihoods. They're also not able to connect back with any of their relatives outside of a district like Puri, outside of the places where they are, where the cyclone has hit, right? So we worked with partners to have solar powered pottery facilities, but design the structure in a way that it can be cyclone resilient. That taking note of wind speeds, taking note of these kind of considerations, they're still able to, the structure itself is strong enough for that. Similarly, when you look at the design of the solar panel for an Anganwadi, that then Anganwadi come temple that then becomes a disaster relief shelter, the panel has to be mounted in such a way that it can handle those wind speeds. The ownership and maintenance of this has to be ensured with a partner, so that even during non-cyclone and non-disaster times, the space is taken care of, the maintenance is managed, the servicing fee can be paid as required, right? And then you have a local entrepreneur who has set up a digital service center. So even at the time of the cyclone in Odisha, once he was able to come back to his setup, he could then start operating a lot of the appliances there. And for people who wanted connectivity, who wanted to charge their mobile phones, this became a hub to be able to do that. I don't think there's time for a video, so I'll just share this later on. But this kind of talks about when we look at socioeconomic vulnerability. So we were talking about climate vulnerability and poverty. Now, when we talk about socioeconomic vulnerability and poverty, we have, tribal communities in Kalahandi in Odisha that often still work on barter systems. Their health indicators may be really poor, and that's simply because access to services has not been made available. And where NGOs or government have tried to provide access to services, they've been restricted by the lack of energy solutions. If we have time, I'll play this at the end. But this talks about a Lok Seva Kendra or a digital service center that is solar powered, because a lot of people used to travel long distances of 50-60 kilometers just for basic printing, photocopying, accessing subsidies, filling applications for government schemes, or for depositing their EMI, because there was no bank correspondent who was coming to the last mile, right? So these centers have become ways for communities to reduce the amount that they have to spend, because there's a lack of road, a lack of energy at that local area. So these centers kind of are solar powered centers that are called Lok Seva Kendras because they are able to do BC services. They are able to do help people with applications for government schemes or for bank transfers, and also be able to do printing, photocopying, digital internet access, and so on. Every time I put a video, it seems to. And maybe the last two, when we're looking at socioeconomic vulnerability, we touched on this briefly yesterday while talking about SDG-5 as well. But these are some examples of innovations for people with disabilities or who are differently abled, where you're talking actively about a solution that can enable this person to then stand on their own feet and provide them an employment opportunity. Otherwise, they're completely dependent on their families or completely dependent on government subsidies in order to simply survive. That safety net is also quite low because, of course, there are the number of people affected by this are much higher than everything that a government or an NGO can support. But how do we then provide the right kind of assets so that individuals who are differently abled can still set up their own businesses and look at that move above the poverty, or create that safety net so they can go beyond that poverty line and establish a more sustainable livelihood for themselves, right? So this was an example of Ilayaraja from Madurai in Tamil Nadu, and he was involved in filling in application forms as part of kind of government documentation, but we were able to work with him to modify his existing scooter in a way that he can now do that printing, photocopying, form submission and application in a more mobile structure, right? So now he's able to move around on his scooter itself and continue this service. If you look at another kind of socioeconomic vulnerability, for example, the transgender community, they are poor because there are certain kind of social or cultural norms within society which have restricted them or prevented them from taking on regular occupation. There's a lot of marginalization that happens with transgender communities that prevent them from getting regular jobs, which means their ability to move out of poverty is restricted severely. So this is another effort where we worked with an NGO that works with transgender community people for establishing or helping a trans woman to set up a micro entrepreneurship business. So she was earlier selling tea on a scooter, but in order to strengthen her income, and both of these cases actually came to us during COVID, because these are people who were most affected by the economic crisis. They had no safety nets to begin with, and it was just worsened by this situation. So we worked on a program called the Resilient Micro Businesses to kind of strengthen the safety nets for these kind of marginalized communities, help build the kind of infrastructure apart from just solar powering, but build the infrastructure, help them with branding, help them with establishing their market so that they could stabilize their income. So from just selling tea on a scooter, she's now become a food cart of sorts, and she's able to sell multiple products and also continue to be mobile. And this has kind of given her an entrepreneurship opportunity that was otherwise restricted often for people from such marginalized communities. I'll stop there, and if there are any questions or thoughts.
It was a very informative session. Actually, ma'am, my question is that you're talking about the decentralized entrepreneurship or distribution of income. Actually, if we see in the cooperative sector, so in Maharashtra there are many cooperative banks and sugar factories, but they are due to improper management or intransparency or maybe political reasons also, they are seen as a failure compared to the corporate sector. So is there something can be done on this or a solution to it?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a very relevant point that you've brought up, that there are failures that happen in cooperatives. There are failures that happen in decentralized models as well, right? But then the question is, what was the reason for that failure? And have we addressed that, or can we address it? So, for example, when we are looking at farmer producer organizations, we are finding that a lot of them are really new, and therefore, if you tell them, okay, you are now a farmer producer organization, you are doing inputs, fertilizers, seeds for farmers, but also here's a cold storage solution, now run it. They're not able to figure it out because they are a relatively new farmer producer organization where they don't necessarily have the capacity right now to look at or understand how do you manage post harvest management. If you or I was suddenly given um, a new business to manage, what are the kinds of skills or appropriate financing that is required for such an entity to actually survive and thrive? So I think what is really important from the two things I think from the example that you brought up is, one, have we, instead of saying they are failures, have we dissected and said what parts of that worked and what parts of it didn't? So in every solution or in every structure, if we are able to dissect and say, certain parts worked and certain parts didn't, then we are in a better position to actually look at replicating the successful processes. I'll give you another example of, when you talk about the green revolution in India, people consider it a success from the point of view of increasing incomes and productivity of land. However, in recent times, we've also become aware that that a big failure of the green revolution has been the fact that there has been overuse of pesticides, overuse of water resources, and that degraded land, especially in parts of North India, right? So, from a climate and an environmental perspective, it has been a failure. But what have we learned from the Green Revolution? So, the Green Revolution actually was critical in establishing motor winding courses in all of the vocational training institutes, so that tomorrow, when there is an irrigation pump on the ground, there are people who can repair and maintain that irrigation pump, right? So that is a process that we should actually be taking from the green revolution and saying that part of it was a success, where they institutionalized certain skills through ITIs and vocational training institutions, because they knew through the program that a lot of pump sets or a lot of new agri machinery was going to be deployed, and there is a need for skills at the grassroots levels to actually be able to maintain that. So yeah, and that part of it can be seen as a success, whereas a lot of the other implications of it may have been a failure. So I think what would be interesting is in this model to kind of dissect it and to be able to say what aspects of the cooperatives have been successful, what aspects have been failures, what aspects, and why were the failures there? Was it political reasons? Was it the fact that sugarcane as an industry itself is a water intensive industry in an area that may not have as much water resources in its water table right now? So are we rethinking agricultural patterns today because you can no longer have farmers in Vidarbha, unable to pay back their loans because they are in so much debt because of lack of rainfall and lack of water resources, and then you have water being guzzled out for sugarcane, right? So I'm just trying to kind of articulate that one is, in any failure, there might be successes that we should bring out and we can learn from for our processes. And two, that any failure is a result of multiple factors. And can we see which part of those factors can be addressed and which of them are just, external factors that cannot be addressed and are circumstantial.
Thanks. So the similar case, if we consider the PSU, that maybe the MTNL, BSNL, they were failures. So as mostly the IS officers are there, but IS also runs the MTNL telecom industry and also runs a chemical industry. So that's I think the issue. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I would say to that, there's also public sector, regional rural banks and nationalized banks that are so critical to rural lending in our country. So, yes, some kind of public sector undertakings have not done well, but other kinds of public sector undertakings are providing the key resources required on the ground. So, and I'm sure, people who have a lot more knowledge on the public sector itself can talk about the failings within that large structure, and maybe it's become too corporate, right? Maybe the decentralization is critical, but you see public sector undertakings functioning for last mile communities and providing those services that they require. So how do we learn from more of the successes?
On the debate of whether decentralization is good or centralization is good, so probably there may not be a unique solution. It should depend upon situation. That is how I think we could take up that.
Yeah. Maybe just one point on that. I think centralized models are relevant in places, and you can see that centralized models have resulted in certain kinds of development, right? I think when we talk about ending poverty, we are talking about the last mile. It's no longer about talking about people who are in cities, and within cities also there are urban slum communities. So centralized solutions have not addressed their needs. I think decentralization really comes in from the perspective of saying, when there is a last mile community or an extremely vulnerable community where centralized solutions have not worked, then why aren't we trying decentralized? Then why aren't we using a solution that could make sure there's better ownership on the ground, that decentralization in terms of infrastructure, in terms of governance, in terms of management, in terms of access to finance is happening better? Because clearly the centralized model has not addressed poverty, right? So I think there is a combination at some level of how those two come together. But when we talk about ending poverty, there's a critical need to look at that decentralization and really see the kind of impact some of that can have over centralized models.
And probably there is a saying that it's not always good to give a fish rather than teach fishing to the community. So in this regard, probably you might have faced some situations where giving resources has not given the results. Some situations which you could highlight.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, for all of the successes that we talk about, there are probably n number of failures, and I'd actually like to invite and encourage all of you, if you can, come to Bangalore on the 25th and the 26th of November in IIM Bangalore. In partnership with IIM Bangalore, we are hosting an impact failure conclave. The idea is really to come together as a development sector and discuss the failures that we've had, right? I think I'll say that from our perspective, there have been innumerable failures of just giving solutions and not for free, so to speak. Either because we have not assessed the capacity of the community itself to then maintain the solution. So the challenge is not giving the solution free. The challenge is really, once that solution is given for free, is there a way to ensure ownership, and is there a way to ensure maintenance and proper utilization, and especially for decentralized sustainable energy solutions? So there have been examples in, actually in Karnataka itself, of decentralized cold storage solutions that during the time of, and I alluded to this earlier, during the time of COVID, we said, okay, how do you create assets for some of these farmer producer groups that have just been set up recently? So solar powered cold storage was one of these solutions, and it was given free of cost because at the time, it was in partnership with the horticulture department, but it was given free because, we don't want to use the word free, but rather that it was given with a large gap financing support, because farmers were affected during this period, and we felt that the solution would help them kind of build that safety net. But what we didn't take into consideration was that, as I mentioned before, these farmers were, the FPO itself was new, which means that the entire board was not really equipped to start a business on cold storage, right? So they did not have post management harvest training, post harvest management training. Two, that these so the utilization then ended up just happening with 10 or so farmers of the board, which means that there's an asset there. It is barely utilized because most of the farmers are not aware that the solution exists. The FPO board may or may not be interested in increasing their capacity because they got a solution, and now they're themselves wondering, do we really want to do the cold storage solution as a business? So this is just one example of, you know, a situation where we did not assess the capacity of the owner to actually run the solution and to actually be able to utilize, maintain, and turn it into a business model. So that was a fault on our assessment process that has resulted in limited utilization. And now what we're having to do is kind of figure out who are the post-harvest management training institutions that can support them, or is there a different FPO that could utilize the solution better? So yeah, just one example of kind of free solutions that have been provided without adequate assessment of what is the need and what is the gap and what is the capacity of that owner to actually utilize, maintain, and turn it into a business model.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'll share the slides, and please let me know if there's anything else. But I'll also share the link to the Impact Failure Conclave, and it would be great to have a lot of you joining us on the 25th, 26th, if you're able to come.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Have a good day.